Greetings, everyone. This is Lindsay Para, and we are back with another Shift Series interview. And I am humbled and honored to be joined by another luminary from the wellness world and the healing world. Kevin is a new friend. We're just making connection, but we have many shared experiences and shared vocabulary on the journey from chronic illness to chronic wellness. And so I'm just excited to have you here and so grateful for you joining us. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. It's great.
It's
great to be here with you.
Will you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be here on the journey that you're on and doing the work that you're doing in the world?
Yeah. Well, you know, my story kind of revolves around Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses, and it's a very common. Unfortunately, it's a very common story of having an illness that was misdiagnosed for many years. And so, you know, I was used to really robust health. I was a documentary filmmaker and traveled all over the world. And I noticed that even back in the 80s when I was working for National Geographic, and, you know, there was sort of this gradual decline of my health and my vitality. And so kind of long story short, it wasn't until 2006 that I was finally accurately diagnosed. And I had to do the diagnosis myself, thanks to Dr. Google.
Right.
And thus began the beginning of the healing journey that lasted for you know, a good 6 years beyond that, because there was this whole, and people who are familiar with chronic Lyme disease will say, yeah, I know what you mean, because there's a whole constellation that often happens with Lyme disease of mold toxicity and heavy metal toxicity and hormone disruption and da-da-da, but none of the doctors that I had access to could put together all these different pieces. And so and then my wife got Lyme disease, and so we were both trying to figure this out. And fortunately, we had, you know, a lot of persistence and kind of good research minds from our background. And we had a couple of neighbors, one in particular who was a godsend, who was a brilliant medical researcher. Her father had been a scientist. And so we were gradually able to piece together how to get well. And at the same time, I was really drawn more and more into my spiritual life, and I became a Reiki master. And then I decided that globetrotting as a filmmaker was not going to really work physically for me anymore. And so I decided to become a transpersonal hypnotherapist. And what I noticed was that each stage of my continued spiritual development, which had always been an important part of my life, but Lyme disease just kind of put this dark cloud over my whole spiritual life. It's the weirdest thing, you know. It's like you can't feel spirit when you're in the midst of neurological Lyme disease, just because of the way that it affects the brain. But with studying Reiki and really taking that in, and studying transpersonal hypnotherapy and experiencing that, there were these greater and greater states of wellness. And at a certain point, I was kind of just thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm a storyteller. And I've made my living telling other people's story as a journey. And it's kind of a mythic journey, although I'm not using that word myth. And whether it was a master archer of Zen archery, or whether it was a Wadabe tribesman in Africa or whatever. And I thought, well, I guess I'm on a journey too. And I realized that the stories that I had been telling about other people were really the hero's myth story in one version or another. And when I started to apply that to myself, then my healing just took an absolute quantum leap. I mean, not, you know, that's kind of an overused word or overused term, but it just went to this whole other level that I didn't even know was possible. Now, I wasn't fully well, but I was remembering, I was able to get these very vivid tastes of what it felt like to have that inner wellness. And so the more that I kind of embraced this idea of being on this hero's journey, you know, completely emerged from the victim trance, transformed my relationship with my doctors, and the ones who could relate to me as an equal and as a partner remained my doctors, and the others I fired.
Yeah.
It's like, no, thank you. And I told them why.
Yes.
I mean, diplomatically, but I told them why.
Yeah.
And so it was really quite a revelation. And at a certain point, when I was when I was feeling well enough, it's like, okay, I think there's something important here that maybe, it certainly has had a big influence on my life. Maybe it can help some other people.
Yeah.
And so I started to really develop it as a protocol, and really, putting different areas together and studying what is known as science as the placebo response, which used to be kind of a dirty word to say, we don't want the placebo response. We want to know exactly how our drugs work. And now there's a whole medical field in the placebo response and psychoneuroimmunology, et cetera, epigenetics, and they're going, oh, this is really great, mind-body, the way the mind can activate the body, the way that stress, but also positive emotions can activate the body. And so really pulling these different elements together into this protocol to maximize a person's ability to generate that positive healing within their own mind. So that's, when I work with clients, sometimes there's a fair amount of projection that goes on. It's like, oh, you're giving me my life back. And it's like, no, this is you. This is all about you. I'm just this humble guide, who's leading you in some ways to these parts of yourself that have always been there, and they're going to be there for the rest of your life after we finish working together. And so I'm really grateful to have kind of, in a way, come upon this protocol, or had the ability to put this together, because it really is tapping into what is inherently ours. This internal wellness, this body that wants to heal, this spirit that wants to be whole. And a lot of it is a matter of kind of stepping out of the way and allowing what is already there to emerge.
Absolutely. When we created
Yeah.
our first app, one of the things that we were really wanting to do was to provide a mirror and a tool of reflection for people to see themselves in a new way and see themselves whole and see themselves in this model of a whole being, not a compartmentalized being, the way either medical practitioners would have us believe we're siloed functions. And I love the way in which you described the story as a mechanism for reflection of the self as well, but not even just a mirror. It actually then becomes the bridge for navigating your way through the journey. Do you use the power of story and storytelling as part of your protocol, or what's the overlap there between seeing the story and your story and the person's journey as part of the healing toolkit?
No, great question. Yeah, the working with story is really kind of the backbone. It's the first thing that I do, I mean, depending on where a person is and what they need most. But there's really the first step is to recontextualize the experience. And so instead of the context being this curse,
Right.
which I mean, bless everybody who has any kind of chronic illness. The nature of a chronic illness means that you've had it for a long time. And so it's very easy for one's identity to become that, and especially if one has lost friends or there's been loss of career and relationships, et cetera. It's terrible. But when we can recontextualize the experience from this horrible curse, which seems to have no end, to a journey, and then the hero's journey, which by nature has these tremendous challenges, and times that seem insurmountable. I mean, that's the kind of the definition of the hero's journey. Is it's not this super being. It's this being who is encountering tremendous challenges which he or she is not prepared for. But then through allies, through internal resources, etc., gains and discovers these inner and these outer resources, this benevolence of the soul and the benevolence of the world, and comes to a new understanding of the self and of the world. And so that's the journey that I help people on. And what happens is that immediately, because this kind of story is really, I guess, built into our DNA. I mean, it's so familiar. That's why we can be with, I've been with tribes people in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and the only Caucasian person there, and they're telling stories to their youth. And this isn't a setup situation. I just happen to be there, and they're telling stories to the boys. And this Tuareg elder, and he was telling a hero's journey story. And in this case, it was about a man needing to learn humility and to gain the heart of a lion. But he went out into the wilderness. He nearly died.
Yeah.
He was kind of beside himself with fear and doubt. And then there was this inner transformation, and he came back, and the woman that he had been wooing, who said, "Come back later when you have the heart of a lion," said, "Okay, I think you've got a heart of a lion now. We can talk."
Right.
So this story is built into our DNA. So what happens when we recontextualize the story of our illness, the experience of our illness, is we're tapping into an archetypal realm that frees up this energy just on its own.
Yeah.
So it's not a matter of having to generate something that requires additional effort. It's like when you align yourself to this archetypal story, to this mythic story of the hero, the energy comes from within, because it's already there, because it's in the matrix of who we are.
Absolutely.
And so that's the great thing. And then with my training as a transpersonal hypnotherapist, I can help a person go very, very deeply into that, and to where a person can have, if they're open enough and everything, a person can have these very deep experiences of wellness, even in the midst of being very ill, because that wellness part is there. It's just waiting for us. And as far as the subconscious mind is concerned, it doesn't know physical illness.
Right.
When we get into that transpersonal realm, and when you touch into that, and the subconscious, the spirit, etc., is immersed in this deep experience of wellness, this remembering of wellness, feeling the sensations of wellness. Well, the body, our physiology, just follows. It says, "Oh, thank you for the reminder. Okay, now we know how to do things." And then the proper genes get activated, etc. So story is really central, and it provides a way of looking at experience that has meaning, and it also helps a person to not feel so alone.
Right.
Because when one is on the hero's journey, then one is you're part of a lineage of heroes, through time.
Right. So beautiful. So help me out with something, because one of the areas that I see friends in the Lyme community, but also clients that have come forward, a place where they get stuck in this story piece is in wanting to know the moment of origin, wanting to know the moment they got sick, or to contextualize it was in fact the tick bite, or maybe it was actually I've always been sensitive, or I did have allergies before. And it's like they're still struggling where to anchor their story in. And it seems like the deeper we get into maybe the shamanic healing side of the chronic wellness journey, or the spiritual side of what's elicited from us through our healing, the more muddied the water gets about what was what and how it all began, and whether to even blame Borrelia in the first place for any of this. What are your thoughts about that very common human desire to say, this is where it all began, and this is this is who to blame, and here's what I've done about it. And I think that that begins to shift.
Yeah. Well,
Did the question make sense, or was that too rambling?
oh yes.
Yeah.
No, it does make sense. And um, it is something that at least initially a person may have to give up.
Yeah.
Because the bottom line for me is this contributing to your healing? And what matters is this moment right now.
Yes.
The origin doesn't matter. What matters is you're on this journey in this place right now, and that has healing power.
Yes.
We are we're trained to be problem solvers. So we're very tend to be very rationally oriented as a culture, and so we're very well trained to look for origins and to, unfortunately, to lay blame.
Right.
So and so my suggestion is to look at that as a habit of mind that is not necessarily actually constructive, and to be willing to suspend the question. And
Yeah.
it's like, okay, well, we're not going to, not going to deny it, not going to, it's not a bad thing, but let's see how that question evolves over time.
Yes.
So let's go on the journey. Let's do the wellness as one's relationship. And I remember when I was obsessed with my own version of that story early on, before it became the hero's journey for me. And I was angry, and then I was hearing things about a biological weapons lab on across
Right.
from Lyme, Connecticut, or Plum Island, and damn, it's the government, and they did it, and it just and it was the Nazis that they brought over from Germany. And what I noticed was it's like going down this rabbit hole. And I'm not saying, I don't know, whether any of that is true. It may all be true, but it wasn't helping me to heal.
No.
What it was doing was making me angry. And it was saying, look what was done to me, which is a way of me taking away my own power.
Yes.
So again, the criteria for me is, does a particular state of mind or does a particular context facilitate healing and wellness or not?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, then I suggest to the people that I work with that they lay that aside, because the real goal is healing. And the real goal is the transformation of mind, as you spoke so well to early on. And that's the other aspect of this whole notion of the hero's journey of healing. And what I do in mind body wellness consulting is to say, okay, you're sick. I mean, you've got this challenge, you got this illness that's going on. We don't know how long it's going to take to heal. We don't know, exactly what's involved, how many layers there are, et cetera. But how about let's look at it as an opportunity?
Yes.
And let's look at this, even the suffering that's involved, and relate with the suffering that is involved almost as a form of fuel, so that it's not futile. It's not a waste of life. Your life isn't about, projecting into the future. And it's like, after I get well, then my life begins again. And it's like, no, your precious, sacred life is right here, right now, in this state of diminished functioning, whatever. Your precious sacred life is right here, right now. So let's make use of the suffering, of the intensity of that, and channel that into the journey of insight. So, in part of what I've been influenced by is shamanism and Tibetan Buddhism, where in Tibetan Buddhism and in both Hindu and in Buddhist Tantra, and that's not sexual tantra. Um, it's all about making use of whatever energy is arising. So if anger is arising, you don't curse the anger, you learn how to relate with it as a form of energy that can then be used for all kinds of things. You know, there's a way of liberating that anger to where it just becomes energy. And it's the same thing with suffering. Suffering is often, there's the physical component of suffering, which is just, ow, this doesn't feel good, or I just feel like, a person could say, I really feel like crap. And it's like, well, okay, so let's get more specific. What are you really feeling? And when a person can get into the feelings, and they can say, well, I'm just really tired. Well, tired doesn't have to be crap. You know, tired can just be tired.
Yeah.
And so it's by kind of removing there's a part of suffering that is optional, which is often the context that we give it, the judgment that we give it, in which we're really judging ourselves and our own experience. So when we remove that judgment, and even relate to that judgment compassionately, then we're left with something else, which isn't the same kind of suffering. And it's not nearly as bad.
That's the alchemy right there.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I love that word. I love that word, alchemy.
That's beautiful. Well, I really want to encourage people to come find their way into your world and to learn more about the healing protocol and your approach. I also want to really just underscore for those who were listening to follow that thread of what Kevin's saying about the power of suspending the question. In my world, especially on the side of my business, in the business alchemy side, we talk a lot about this phenomenon of being in the not knowing. And what Kevin described is being in the not knowing from this place of opportunity and compassion for self, and how that then becomes the catalyst for the alchemy, the turning that suffering or grief or whatever it is into the gold of opportunity. And I just really want to underscore as well how releasing that need to know what was and the story of origin is also part of the magic that releases us from the feeling that we somehow need to know the outcome. And so it's hugely liberating when we can, as Kevin said, be in the moment and allow this moment to redefine the who we are and this sacred vessel for this experience that we've been given right here. So I have a question for you, and I ask this question at the end of every interview, which is someone who's found their way into this conversation, and they may not be exactly sure where to start after having listened and been activated by these concepts and ideas. Is there one thing that you might recommend that a person could do, just one thing that anyone could do regardless of location or resources or diagnosis, one thing they could do to begin to invite this kind of transformation into their life and align themselves to chronic wellness in this way?
Well, one way would be, probably the simplest way would be to familiarize oneself with the story of the hero's journey, with the hero myth.
Yeah.
And there's the classic book by Joseph Campbell, Hero with a Thousand Faces. Yeah. And it's a little bit academic at times, but I love his writing. It's just so rich and so compassionate. And if that book doesn't do it for you, I'm sure if you search online and look with that kind of title, that kind of subject, there's going to be many books that have been written about it. Because again, when you tap into that story and and it's pretty easy to identify with the story. I mean, that's something that I would say is that just exposing yourself to the story, I think most people, if not everyone, is going to look and go, wow, a hero isn't, I thought it was about superhero. It's like, no, it's always, almost always, it's an ordinary person, right, like you and I, who's meeting up against extraordinary circumstances. Right. And so that can be a source of comfort. And again, the more that you start to identify with it, the more there will be this energy that'll be liberated from within. And I just wanted to say something very briefly about what you're saying with being in that space of not knowing, and that's the basis of every spiritual tradition. Every spiritual tradition talks about the dark night of the soul, etc. And what that's about is about where the power of habitual identification, what we call the ego, which is not an enemy, but has its limits. Illness can be this don't know mind, as one Buddhist master termed it. The space of not knowing is the place that all these traditions are aiming for. Whether it's going on a spiritual retreat and sitting in zazen for hours and hours and days, and it's always about taking that mind into the place of not knowing because of what emerges.
Right.
So there's a little bit of an element of faith in that, in saying, okay, well, it's letting go of this familiar and trusting that something of one's own indigenous wisdom is going to arise as a result, which is indeed what happens. And then you become more receptive to the wisdom and the compassion of the world, the benevolence of the world as well.
Yeah.
So
Beautiful. Well, I want to encourage everyone to find you online. Where is the best place for them to find you and follow you?
My website is www.inneralliance.net, which is INNERALLIANCE.net.
Wonderful. And are you on social media anywhere?
I do have a Facebook page, but I'm not very active on that at the moment.
All right.
But
Great.
so the website is the main. Yeah, that's the main place. Yeah.
Great. So I do want to encourage people, go ahead and reach out to Kevin via his website. If ever needed, you can, of course, reach out through Chronic Wellness and Full Circle Wellness tools as well, and we're always happy to connect people. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me today and accepting this invitation and bringing your thoughts and your light forward. It was really a pleasure to experience being a part of your journey and your story.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Really nice to meet you and to be with you.
You as well. Well, thank you everyone who found your way to this Shift Series interview. Really appreciate your time here. I hope you will trust that you were led into this conversation for a reason and open yourself up to any of the seeds that may have been planted. And we wish you well on your journey to chronic wellness. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.